Hello, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to take a look at the overview of what happens in Chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby and analyze some of the things that Fitzgerald is doing with his language and characters. And thank you to Lena L. from SlideShare for the PowerPoint. So the first thing we want to review is, as we head into Chapter 4, is this idea that Fitzgerald is giving us of romantic idealism. So this is this concept that Gatsby has. It's almost naive, this idea of a perfect world without factoring the kind of flaws that actually exist in real life. The idea of ideal romance has to do with a hope for a love that's so strong that you don't even recognize the flaws of the people that you're in love with. As a matter of fact, their flaws sort of become part of what you love about them. And sometimes, though, when people get into this kind of idealism, that person becomes this vision in their mind of something perfect, but the real person can't ever live up to it. So eventually you have this disappointment and this disillusionment, and imagination and hope kind of run smack into reality and don't survive it. Chapter 4 returns us to a party scene at Gatsby, and at this time we're hearing all of these wild rumors about him. So the guests have come back again, and they're sitting around gossiping all about the host. They're not only gossiping, they're saying some pretty ugly things about him too, even while they're eating and drinking all of his food, and even taking the roses right out of his garden. Note that they don't really care what the truth is, or what kind of damage they're doing, or what kind of person Gatsby is. All they care is that they're getting, a free party night there. They're really just using him for his wealth. Fitzgerald introduces us to some of the people at this party, including some known celebrities of the day and some fictional characters that he adds in. One such is Benny McClanahan, and he says Benny McClanahan arrived always with 4 girls. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical one with another that it was inevitably seemed they had been there before. This idea that the girls are completely interchangeable, that they just kind of blend in, and that the men in the society are not taking women seriously, that women are superficial and they're just decoration, and that these are actually artificial people who are surrounding themselves with other artificial people in artificial relationships. Nick starts to notice some things about Gatsby. Even though these are his parties, he always seems separate and apart. He never drinks at his own parties, and he always seems restless. Fitzgerald tells us he was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere and the impatient opening and closing of a hand. This idea that Gatsby doesn't seem comfortable or settled anywhere, and his restlessness sort of reflects his unhappiness with what's going on in his life. Nick is frankly a little disappointed. All of this conversation and all of this speculation about who is Gatsby, and he finally gets to meet him, and Gatsby doesn't really say very much. And Nick had this great image of the mysterious, just like the title says, The Great Gatsby, built up in his mind. But like a lot of other characters we'll see in this novel, they tend to be disappointed when they realize that they had this vision and then they have the reality, and that the two don't often have something to do with each other. Now, this look at disillusionment is not accidental. We take a look at Gatsby's history and this idea again of the lost generation. These are this group of people who were taught that the world would be wonderful if they just did what they were told, and then they found out, guess what, it really wasn't. And then we hear some bits about Gatsby's history. Nick and Gatsby take this car ride, and Gatsby starts springing out all of this information about himself, and Nick says it sounds a little, rehearsed and fake even. He doesn't even quite believe it. We hear that Gatsby claims that he came from a wealthy Midwestern family, that his whole family is dead now, but he says a Midwestern family in San Francisco. Okay, now I know you know something about geography, and San Francisco is not in the Midwest by any stretch of the imagination. He claims he was educated at Oxford, but he says it the way that you say something that you don't really believe. And Nick starts to wonder if there's not some background on Gatsby that he should know more about. But whatever it is, he certainly seems to have a good deal of money. Gatsby said he inherited all from his family when he died, and he says this very solemn as though he's still haunted by the fact of his family's death. But Nick doesn't quite trust all of this. Gatsby goes on to recite his history like he's telling you some kind of a story. He says, I lived like a Raja, like a prince, in the capitals of Europe, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting. So trying to forget something very sad that had happened to me long ago. And this idea again that is he's going out and trying to do all of this crazy stuff just to distract himself from this sad thing in his past. And Nick's reaction to this is very interesting. Remember, Nick told us in the opening chapter that his lesson from his father was to keep an open mind about people and to not judge. But even as he's listening, he says, I don't know. I keep picturing him like someone who's spinning these wild stories for me. He's more like this comical adventurer. Like, I just don't know if I can trust all this crazy business he's telling. And Gatsby even goes on to talk about how much pain he was in from this terribly sad thing. He said, I tried very hard to die in the war, but I seem to bear an enchanted life. This idea that he's like suicidal, like trying to be a hero and go out there in the war because he just doesn't care what happens to him, and that this is still lingering and causing him all kinds of grief and pain. But then there's some proof. There's pictures. There's notices that he was at Oxford. There's this medal that he says he was given by the country of Montenegro for heroic deeds. So, he's really not, Nick's really, again, not sure, just when he thinks that, oh, Gatsby's just making all this up, there seems to be some elements of truth after all. Gatsby seems really intent on making sure that Nick likes him and respects him. He offers proof of his story here. He says he wouldn't want Nick to think he was a nobody. Like, this is important to him to prove this to Nick. And with it, he's often around strangers. He's drifting just to forget his past. And Nick seems to understand that Gatsby's pain and the money are really a quest to find a way to forget whatever this painful event was from his past. Now, after this car ride into the city, Gatsby starts to introduce Nick to some of his business associates. And the most interesting one that Fitzgerald tells us about is Meyer Wolfsheim, and he's described as being small, flat-nosed, Jewish, and a gambler. We learned that he used to like the restaurant across the street better, but he talks about better because then he describes this drive-by gang shooting from the 1920s where they were sitting there and all of a sudden their friends got shot. And then there's this casual bit that's dropped that this man, Meyer Wolfsheim, he's the one that fixed the 1919 World Series. Like, he's that much of a Poland gambler that he arranged all of that. And he keeps looking around the restaurant as though he's paranoid that someone's, going to come after him or maybe jump out of a car and shoot him too, like his friends. Now, there's this interesting disconnect here where Gatsby is introducing Nick to Meyer Wolfsheim, but realizes that Nick is not interested in making a business connection. That it's kind of that criminal element side there. Wolfsheim represents this world of crime and this idea that Gatsby's business that he's doing is probably not something that Nick wants to get involved with. And we see Fitzgerald creating Meyer Wolfsheim as this complete caricature of Jewish people. It reflects a lot of the really negative and prejudicial views that people had at the time. And remember, this is before Hitler, but some of the things that led up to that we saw talk about those dark sides of the 1920s. And is Fitzgerald telling us in this chapter that this is how Gatsby got rich? And does this change the way the reader is supposed to feel about Gatsby at this point in the story? Now, so far, we haven't seen Gatsby really involved with any women, even though there's all these beautiful women around him all the time. And we've shown that Gatsby is very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife. And is this meant to be a foil to Tom, who we're told was having an affair on his honeymoon? We know was having an affair with Myrtle. Gatsby seen rather as a man who would honor marriage. But since we know that the motivating factor in all of Gatsby's actions is his love for Daisy, the interest in Daisy here, and even though Daisy is married, he doesn't honor that marriage. When it comes to this ideal love, Gatsby has no qualms about this because he really believes that Tom and Daisy never really had a relationship at all, that he and Daisy are the soulmates that are fated to be together, and there's no possible way that anything that she's had with Tom means anything, even if it is an official marriage. But if you think about it for a minute, there's some interesting things. I mean, Tom and Daisy, whether or not they really were in love with each other, they do have a daughter together. And what's Gatsby going to do when he finds that out? I mean, it's one thing to think about this girl that he might have met years ago, but this idea now, is he going to come into another man's wife and the mother of someone else's child? This little daughter, Pammy, the one that Daisy said she wanted to grow up to be a beautiful fool because she'd be beautiful, but she wouldn't understand all the terrible things that were going on in the world around her. This is a physical manifestation that Daisy and Tom share a past, that Daisy is no longer this pure and innocent little girl that he fell in love with. Daisy's been married, she's had a sexual relationship with her husband, she's had a baby, and she's had some reality and circumstances that are not perfect. Remember, her husband taking a phone call from his mistress at the dinner table. So life hasn't been exactly perfect for Daisy here either, and she is not the little girl that he met so many years ago. And here we get Jordan telling a story about what Daisy was like. We see this picture of young Daisy. So first of all, she was the prettiest, the richest, the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. And the one that Jordan most admired, Jordan said, I looked up to her, we all did. And she always dressed in white. She drove this cute little expensive white roadster car. And she's, again, this interesting juxtaposition between innocence and the corruption of innocence. Daisy's always dressed in white and gold. Those are the colors that go with her all the time. And Jordan says the phone rang all day long. It was always men, always calling for Daisy. They always wanted to take her out on dates. They always wanted to buy her things. Now remember, she's from this very rich, well-to-do family, but she is definitely the getting all of the suitors coming to her doorstep. And one suitor she meets one night is this handsome young officer in dress whites named Jay Gatsby. And Fitzgerald tells us that Gatsby looked at Daisy in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime. In other words, this idea that some man would just sweep you off your feet and be so enamored with you that you became the center of his universe. Now, we know that the adult Jordan now didn't recognize Gatsby, so that suggests that he's changed some over time as well. And we know that he's gone now from being this poor soldier into this really wealthy man. And what has this quest for wealth done to Gatsby? How has he changed since this dashing young officer that swept Miss Daisy off her feet? And we get a little bit of this background. Daisy was going to run away with Gatsby. The family didn't approve of the match because Gatsby had no money. He was a little nobody from nowhere. But Daisy was willing to ditch it all and run away with him. But her family found out about it, locked her up in the room, and some time goes by, and she's young. She's 16. queen. She wants to go out all the time. She loves Gatsby and she wants to wait for him. But you know what? He's gone off to war. So many of those young men were killed in the war. And after a little bit of time, Daisy either, being more of a realist than Gatsby was, or maybe just being a little, not as loyal and not as much in love as he was, starts to date other people. And then we get to Daisy and Tom. And we learn from Jordan that this was an incredibly expensive marriage, that Tom gave her a string of pearls valued at, and this is 1920s times, $350,000. But even then, the day of the wedding, Jordan found Daisy lying on the bed, it says, as lovely as the June night in her flowered dress and as drunk as a monkey. Daisy had gotten her hands on a bottle of wine the night before her wedding, was totally wasted, and was sitting there in one hand with the letter from Gatsby saying, please wait for me, and in the other hand, this string of pearls from Tom. And she throws away the string of pearls and says, I can't do it, tell them I'm not coming. But Jordan and her family get her sobered up, get her in the bathtub. We watch this letter from Gatsby dissolve. That's intentional, saying, what's dissolving with her feelings. And despite her strong feelings for Gatsby, the next morning, she puts on the dress and she marries Tom Buchanan. And Jordan tells us that they actually seemed to be, pretty happy for a while. Daisy seemed to be crazy for her husband, following him around everywhere. But then Tom had this car accident, and it kind of turned out that the car accident, that he wasn't alone in the car, that he was driving around with one of the maids from the hotel, and basically he'd already started cheating on Daisy before they were really even done with their honeymoon. So Jordan goes on to tell us more about their life after they got married, and the bloom was off the rose here, and they traveled around a lot. They were young, they were rich, they were wild, but she didn't seem to be troubled by this. We learned that Daisy, and who is this like? Gatsby, also doesn't drink, and says that this makes it you can be sober while everybody else is kind of losing it around you, and gives you a certain advantage over everybody else. And now you start to see how the stories mesh back up again. So Gatsby is not killed in the war. He makes his fortune. He comes back home to find Daisy, and what does he find? She's been married to somebody else for several years now. But that doesn't stop him. Instead, he takes this money, he buys this house, and now we start to know what this green light is that he's reaching towards across the bay. Fitzgerald tells us that Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. And that green light that he's reaching for, remember green and the archetypal symbols, green always means go, spring, new, growing, new chances. And he's always reaching towards that. That's where Daisy is. That's his hope. That's his growth. That's what he's trying to go for right there. And as Nick says, he came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. In other words, Nick now understands that Gatsby does have a purpose for everything that he's been doing. Everything that Gatsby is doing and has done has been about and for Daisy. All of his actions, trying to get this money, putting these things in, throwing these parties, hoping that she'll wander in and just be impressed with him, goes back to the fact that he was a poor boy in love with a rich girl, and now he wants to prove to her that he's worthy of her. But start thinking about this for a minute. I mean, would you work that hard to get somebody who basically married somebody else, saying to you, rich girls don't marry poor boys? Don't you know that? Is she so shallow that that's what will draw her in, is money, that he can't win her back with his personality and their relationship? Is this someone who's actually worth everything that Gatsby has been working for? Or is Gatsby himself also a little superficial? The idea that, is he more in love with the idea of love and wants the idea of Daisy to say, hey, I'm able to, I caught this amazing catch of a person, or does he really love her? He does seem to be using material items also to gain emotional happiness, and knows that Daisy is materialistic, but this doesn't bother him. He's actually stooping down to her level to try to impress her. And what Fitzgerald is doing here is talking again about romantic idealism. Gatsby had a strong desire for the American dream represented by Daisy and thinks the best way to get that is by making a lot of money. But in order to make his money, he's got to commit some crimes and do some stuff that makes it almost impossible that she will be impressed with this. So you've got this idea of the purity of love and then the reality of the world and the way he's earning money, and these things just really don't mix. Now I want to close here for a moment with a look at this developing relationship between Nick and Jordan. Now, Jordan has a lot in common with Daisy. She comes from the same circle. She's also very wealthy. She's also very superficial. But Nick seems to see this. He knows that Jordan is dishonest. He knows that she lies about stuff, that she cheated at golf. But he seems to kind of accept it as that's just the way she is. I get it. And he's not picturing this lifelong, thing of happiness with her. She's just somebody to spend time with right now. And it's an interesting contrast that, he's more of this realist than the dreamer that Gatsby is. And we see Jordan as being a very physical, realistic, but Daisy is always in white and in gold and has this voice that makes everyone lean in really close and listen. And Nick seems to know that people are not perfect, but Gatsby still seems to think that perfection is Daisy. So in closing, as you start to get into the next couple of chapters, start thinking about this. Do you think Daisy can live up to what Gatsby believes is true about her? What will happen when they meet up together, and where's the relationship going to go? Why is it important? Is Fitzgerald telling us that it's important to realize that nobody's perfect? And what do you think is going to happen when Gatsby's dream, this green light that he's reaching for, everything that he's worked for here, starts to encounter the reality of Daisy's marriage and child and actual personality? And that's it. We'll see you for chapter 5.